we're going to continue to talk about faithfulness. And last week we're going to start looking at specifically, we were looking at ways that God has shown himself to be faithful to us, and we started switching last week to showing how others in the Bible have shown themselves to be faithful. So we're going to continue to talk about that today, but before we get on our example in the Bible of our person who has been faithful, I want to begin by reading you a sign that it was inscribed on the wall of Shishu Bhavan. You all know where that's at, right? It's a children's home in Calcutta, India. It's a children's home in Calcutta, India that specifically was one of the ones that Mother Teresa worked with. Engraved on the wall is a sign, and it is a great sign. I love it. Well, I guess it's more like a poem than a sign. But it says, I'll read it to you, it says, "People are unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. If you are successful, you win false friends and true enemies. Succeed anyway. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness makes you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. When you spend years building, what you spend years building may be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. People really need help, but they may attack you if you help them. Help people anyway. Give the world the best you have and you'll get your teeth kicked in. Give the world the best you've got anyway." You see, that poem is called Anyway. This poem, inscribed on the wall of a children's home in the slums of Calcutta, conveys a basic truth about faithfulness. Faithfulness is not just hard, but if you are faithful, you will incur suffering if you choose to practice the kind of faithfulness that God has displayed towards us. Humanity is not worthy of the kind of faithfulness that we are called and directed to give it. Faithfulness will be met with opposition, ridicule, and with struggle. It's no small investment, rather it is a pouring out of everything we are in order to receive something much greater. No one ever said that the pouring out would be a painless process, though, did they? We will be met with trials and with failures, but we stand on the promise of great victory because of faith. This poem is powerful because it doesn't sugarcoat reality, but rather it simply says, this is the way it is. You know what you're supposed to do, so do it anyway. David is an excellent example of this, King David in our Bibles. The only person in all of Scripture to be described as a man after God's own heart. David was far, far, far from being perfect, or even being able to be said righteous. He relied on God's grace in order to be made righteous, just as we have to in the same way, right? But you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who was more faithful to God and his people than David was. It's easy to be faithful when everything is perfect. It's easy to find a healthy, thriving congregation in a neighborhood where everybody's making six figures. That's just the way it is. It's easy to be faithful when everything is perfect, no bills are due, and everybody agrees with you. But true faithfulness is displayed when the action of practice of our faith demands a great personal price. To sacrifice our own well-being, whether it be our reputation, our authority, our financial security, or even maybe our physical safety. This is where David shined the brightest. In fact, it was actually the easy times where he seemed to screw up. It was the hard times where he did really well. To preface David's story a little, we'll have to mention 1 Samuel and Saul. In 1 Samuel 8, the Israelites demand of Samuel that we want a king just like all the other nations. God says, this is a bad thing, but give it to them anyway. If that's what they want, let them have it. Just make sure you warn them of the consequences. So God then sends Samuel to anoint the first king of Israel, who is Saul. Saul was the kind of king that Israel wanted. Strong, manly, handsome, taller than the rest. I joke around with over at Pontiac Nursing Home, we were reading this. Every time you read through 1 Samuel, I give them a recap of what we talked about before. And I said, Saul was strong, handsome, manly. Kind of a man's man. I said, just like me, right? He was handsome. They'd all laugh, And that would be the end of that. He was the kind of man that made the girls swoon. The kind of man that we all want to be, right, Carl?
Hey.
It all started... I said we. I only needed to get one girl to swoon, and that was good enough for me. I thought I did a pretty good job there. It all started off well enough. Saul prophesied with the prophets. He won victories, giving God the glory. He was quite humble in the beginning. Then, things started to change. And we began to learn just how true that statement is, that power corrupts. See, Saul wasn't content with being just the king. So he started extending his authority over other things as well. In his impatience, he began to practice the authority of the priest. He made rash vows that hurt his army greatly and even almost saw his son put to death. And then he started building monuments after great military victories. Problem was, who were the monuments built to? To Saul. Okay, you know you got a big ego when you got to build. You know you have a big ego when you have to build a giant statue of yourself, right? There were monuments to the one who gave them the victory. Only he was claiming that he was the one who gave them the victory. So essentially, the monuments to himself were taking on the role of God by taking his credit. So by saying I gave us victory, he's saying God did not, and saying I am God. Do we see any problems here? Right? The straw that broke the camel's back is when he decided to directly disobey a command that God gave him in order that he could have a great big feast and a party and say, oh, but this great big feast and party is for God. But, man, we're eating well tonight. Saul was rejected as king over Israel, and so God sent Samuel to anoint another. This is where David enters the story. Much to Samuel's surprise, David is the one whom God chooses. The youngest in the family, and still only a very young teenager. But it is as God told Samuel. He does not judge by appearance as we do, but rather by heart. So being God's anointed, surely everything just started going perfect for David, right? Everything worked out perfectly because he is God's anointed. Well, in the beginning that was the case. Brought into Saul's home to play the harp, defeating Goliath, and being given the daughter of Saul in marriage. He was taken in by Saul as a son. He was living in the palace with the king. But as victory piled upon victory, promotion was added on to promotion until one day, all of these great blessings drew a little too much attention. Riding home with Saul from a great victory one day, the women gathered around the streets and they were singing their songs and they were singing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. I'd be content with thousands. And this was the beginning of the end. Saul was jealous and paranoid. David is going to take my throne. Only problem was that David was in fact more loyal to Saul than anyone else was. David's perfect world was shattered. by throwing spears at him. They come home from this victory. Saul goes nuts, and he's hurling spears at David. But do you know David still sticks around? I mean, obviously he runs away, but then he comes back, and he's still there. And so, guess what? He does it again. Let's hurl spears at David. David's obviously pretty quick because he missed every time and he dodged them. But David still comes back. And so then he commands David to start making these provocative, impossible attacks on the Philistines. Well, surely the Philistines will handle David for me. Problem is God gave David success in everything he was doing. So instead of David coming back defeated, the people fell in love with David all the more. Saul became more jealous, and now he's got even more of a reason to fear that David's going to take my throne. So Saul's son Jonathan finds out about another assassination attempt. This time Saul's going to talk to his generals and have David killed. But Jonathan's able to talk him out of it. But then Saul goes into another fit of rage, and he's planning again for a way to kill David. But this time Jonathan finds out again. And so he warns David, and this time David has to run. He can't stay in Israel any longer. Well, in the king's palace any longer. He's on the run. He flees to Nob, starving without a weapon. The priest at Nob gives David some food and the sword of Goliath at David's request because he thinks that David is running an errand for Saul. He didn't yet know that Saul was trying to kill David. So Saul responds by showing up and saying, "You help David?" And Saul murders 85 priests. And then goes down into the city and kills every man, woman, and child in the city of Nob. Because they helped David, thinking that David was doing something for Saul. Saul is clearly now a certifiable madman, isn't he? David is the anointing of God, but David definitely doesn't have a perfect little world, does he? Pretty far from it. David runs home. He races home to his family. And he takes his father and mother. And he takes them into the land of Moab because they aren't safe in Israel anymore. Then David returns to Israel and he continues to run and hide, always trusting in God. Remember that David at this time is still a teenager. Okay? He's a teenager dealing with all of this. This all went on for years, until eventually David was not safe anywhere in Israel. And so he had to leave, because Saul was pursuing him with 3,000 soldiers. And so David leaves for the land of the Philistines, where he hides for a year and 4 months, before finally able to return to Israel after Saul dies in battle. Now, in the middle of all of this story, there is a pretty powerful little story of just how faithful David was to Saul and to God. See, David understood that it didn't matter how bad God was. It didn't matter how bad Saul was. It didn't matter how many terrible things Saul did to David. In order for David to be faithful to God, David understood that he must be faithful to Saul. Didn't matter what Saul did to him, David must treat Saul well if he is to be faithful to God. He must continue to treat Saul in a gracious and merciful manner because that is how God has treated him. And by extension treated us, right? So turn with me over to 1 Samuel chapter 24. We're going to read this little story here. 1 Samuel chapter 24, and it is still working. So we're up on the board behind me as well. 1 Samuel chapter 24. We're going to start in verse 3. 1 Samuel chapter 24, starting in verse 3. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. God doesn't have a sense of humor, huh? And the men of David said to him, Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hands, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Oops, I'm sorry. I was going to read one more verse. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave, and he called after Saul, My Lord the king! And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. This man, Saul, has done how many terrible things to David? That would be an understatement, right? How many people do we know that have done as many terrible things to us as Saul did to David? I really can't think of any. And now, this man is literally caught with his pants down, with David and 600 men sitting there watching. Could there possibly be a more prone position, or maybe a more embarrassing position, than the one in which Saul is now found? He has gone into a cave in order to relieve himself, thinking he's all alone, but there is David and 600 men watching you do your business. I mean, you got to imagine as David came out, Saul probably turned many different shades of red. Shades of red we didn't even know existed. This is the same Saul which was pursuing David with an army of 3,000 men in order to kill every single man in that cave. Obviously, there were some security concerns for Saul, wasn't there? They're not doing a very good job, are they? How well can you actually hide 600 men? Clearly somebody didn't go into the cave and look first. So the moment of truth arrives, and it reveals some things about faithfulness. It can be very complicated. It isn't quite as much of a cut and dry situation as we necessarily think it is it? You do this here, you do that there, and that's what it means to be faithful. But we're caught in a corner. We're caught in situations where we say, I think it will be all right for me to actually do that now. I think it'll be all right. Maybe God actually planned for me to be able to do this now. Because clearly God has allowed this to happen. God gave me the opportunity. How many of us would consider David's killing of Saul in this moment to be a just act? David's men clearly thought so. Would David be unfaithful to God if he slayed his enemy? In fact, this situation becomes a little bit more complicated when you take notice that David's men are actually not just encouraging David to do this, but they are trying to tell David, do you realize that this is a gift from God? This is an anointed moment by God. God has done this so that you can get rid of Saul. This is God's will here. How many times have we heard things like that? Where there's something that we're not really sure. I don't think I'm supposed to do that. But somebody's saying, no, this is God's will for you to do that. It's a good thing. And we're like, I'm not. Okay. Remember, who knows the Bible better than we do? The devil. Right? How many times have we seen things twisted around to say, oh, this is a godly thing, right? I have a right to this. I have a right to that. It's called justice, right? But mercy and grace tend to contradict justice quite a bit. Oof. The world around David says, have every right to do this to Saul. In fact, they might even say, if you refuse, or rather, you have no right to refuse. If you refuse, you're contradicting justice. Justice demands that you take this opportunity given by God. A little bit of arm twisting going on here, right? And this arm twisting makes a lot of sense. Notice that even after David has made his difficult decision, now he has to convince 600 men not to jump in and do it for them. Because Saul is not just after David, he's after those 600 men too. All of their lives are just as much as in danger as David's. Just because the argument can be made that David's action would be just and good does not mean that it would be the right action for him to take. To be faithful to God means that we hold ourselves to higher standards. You might gossip about me, but that doesn't mean I'm allowed to gossip about you. You might say hurtful words to me, and it does not mean I can say hurtful words to you, even if you're not around. We're held to a higher standard. We do not make our choices based on what we are or are not allowed to do. Yes, I might be allowed to do this, but that doesn't mean it's good for me to do this. Doesn't mean it's faithful for me to do this. How many times have children been told, never hit unless someone else hits you first? And then, then it's okay. But guess what? Both are going to get suspended from school. Is that the kind of response that's really ever going to solve anything? Okay, if the child hits back, what's going to happen next? The other child's going to hit back. That doesn't solve the problem. That makes the problem bigger. That logic would dictate that David should act right here and now. Well, Saul hit first. David has been fleeing with 600 men for how long? And not once has David ever engaged Saul or any of his men. Not even in an act to defend himself. David was not a slave to retaliatory logic. David made his decisions based on God's will and God's desires. No matter how complicated, difficult, or how much of a so-called right we think we have, God's values must always be held firm. Right will always be right and wrong will always be wrong. Even, it doesn't matter how difficult the decision is. Right and wrong still do exist. Just because the right decision has become more difficult to make does not mean we are somehow free from the obligation of making it. David's decision has virtually no benefit for him. When this is all done, Saul says, "Oh, you're right, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that." And Saul goes home. But David goes back to hiding in the hills. Because guess what? Saul's going to do the same thing 2 chapters later. And David's going to have the same opportunity to kill Saul again 2 chapters later. And David's going to do the exact same thing again 2 chapters later. Saul will continue to pursue David for many years. And eventually David's going to have to leave Israel altogether and hide in the land of the Philistines. Do we see how David's faithfulness is rewarded here? Because so many times we consider, well, I'm only going to be faithful if it somehow benefits me. But how does David's faithfulness here benefit him? Saul is still around. Saul is still trying to kill him. David is still running. And now he even has to run further away. Wouldn't getting rid of Saul have solved all those problems? David's still unable to go home. His family is still in Moab, and Saul still wants him dead. The faithful decision does not guarantee us a prosperous outcome. Just because we do the right thing does not mean everything's going to suddenly work out for us. Remember last week when we talked about faithfulness, we said that faithfulness is sacrificing for the sake of someone else. Giving of our own well-being so that another might be lifted up. Oftentimes, when we act faithfully, we gain nothing out of it, especially in the short term. But we must understand that when we encounter a problem, all right, sometimes there's not a solution. There's not a solution to every problem. But we must understand that there is a choice that will always make the problem worse. And then there is a choice that might make it better. Not guaranteed, but might make it better. When we're talking about faithfulness, this is oftentimes what we're talking about. To be faithful does not solve every problem. But it is the only answer that has any possibility of solving that problem. In the long term, all of this does eventually come back in David's favor. His faithfulness is eventually rewarded. Actions like this, as well as his genuine mourning for Saul's death, his condemnation of the murder of his enemies, and other faithful acts, faithful but nearly impossible acts, they endear him in the eyes of the people of Israel. And so David receives loyalty and support because of his faithfulness to God in the most difficult of times. It is very easy for us to rejoice in the failings of our enemies. And yes, we do have enemies. We may not call them enemies. We might say, well, isn't enemy a little harsh word for that? We've got enemies. We've got people we disagree with. We've got people who do hurtful things to us. We have enemies. And it is easy to rejoice when they slip and fall. Okay, let's admit it. We've probably all done that. No, not probably. We have all done that, here or there. It is simple for us to fling a sarcastic or hurtful word because one has already been hurled at us. It is justice for us to exercise our right for revenge, reparation, or punishment. But it is not faithfulness. It will solve nothing. Rather, it will only create a bigger problem. Because of David's faithfulness, he eventually, and when we say eventually, we're talking years and years down the road, he eventually comes to the throne of Judah without even the slightest bit of a fight. He sits back, and he doesn't go on the offensive against the rest of Israel, but he sits back. He is attacked by the north, but he does not go and try to take it himself. And eventually, after 7.5 more years, Israel comes to him and asks him to be their king. So notice that he becomes the king of Judah and then of all of Israel without ever actually going to war to claim those titles. Faithfulness provides the possibility for long-term solutions. Again, not always, but a rash, and sometimes we might even say a justified decision will never, ever, 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 ever provide a solution. It will always make the problem worse. It may give us the illusion of progress, but it is just that, an illusion. In order for us to live lives that are both pleasing and fulfilling to us and to God, we must encounter an unfaithful world with continuing faithfulness. We're thinking back to our home at the beginning, right? We must love anyway. We must forgive anyway. Give anyway. Do good anyway. Help anyway. And most of all, we must continue to be faithful anyway.